Back when I started climbing, there were a few photos which really inspired me. One was Ed Drummond's shot of Pete Crew on Great Wall at Cloggy. It's a really evocative black and white photo, showing Crew on his tiptoes reaching upwards into the dark recesses above. It scared the shit out of me, if I'm honest. I loved Drummond's piece in hard rock, and he really embodied the kind of anti-hero persona that I loved in climbing stories. This is something I think about when I'm putting these episodes together. What kind of hero is my protagonist? Are they the anti-hero? Stevie Hastons or the Don Willans of the world? The classical hero, Chris Bonington? Willing heroes, unwilling heroes, tragic heroes? All of the stories that we tell are built out of these basic structures. I had loads of photos torn from magazines on my wall as a teenager, and one was John Dickey's shot of Leo Houlding on the route that would later become the Prophet. Naturally, Leo was one of my heroes at the time. In the picture, Leo has his left foot high, rocking over. He's way above his gear, crimping the edge of a flared seam, and there's just this total focus in his eyes. He's right there at the limit of what's possible, absolutely on sight on a really dangerous route. And I was so inspired by this. This was what I wanted my climbing to be. Putting yourself out there in this really emotional experience. When I caught up with Leo, what I really wanted to know was how he became this person that would put himself in that position. Because people don't do ground-up first ascents on El Cap. People don't even try to do that. The seed for the Prophet had been planted a few years earlier, on Leo's first visit to Yosemite as an 18-year-old. Along with Patch Hammond, he made a near on-site ascent of El Niño, over 5 days. What's weird is that they hadn't even intended to climb a big wall on this trip. So how the hell did this happen? You're listening to Factor 2 from UK Climbing.
In 1998 was a bit of a watershed year for me, really. I was 18 and I left home a couple of years earlier. I grew up not far from here in the lakes and then left after my GCSEs. My birthday's late in the year, so I'm young. So I left home when I was 15, basically, and moved to Clonberis area to start my A-levels at a college down there, which I promptly dropped out of, and then bummed around with no money for a couple of years. And then 1998 was the year that I first got a proper sponsorship deal back with Berghaus. So I had a little bit more than no money. And then that Yosemite trip in the autumn that year was my first proper trip, really, my first long trip. And Yosemite is, you know, it's Yosemite, isn't it? It's certainly the Mecca, it's the crucible, it is the best climbing area in the world. And I went with my mate Patch Hammond, another 18-year-old from Wales, and both climbing really well, both competently on site in E7 quite regularly. We didn't actually go with any major plans. We just wanted to go and check it out. And that was what brought us to the Holy Grail.
Finding the Holy Grail. That's definitely a quest for a hero. In wondering what kind of hero Leo was, I thought about the story of Alexander the Great. So back when he's just 20, Alexander's father Philip is assassinated and he becomes the leader of this growing nation. He goes off and fights wars in Persia and then later India. He genuinely believes that he's immortal and he's not even subject to physical risk that other people would face. He thinks he's actually a deity. And he never loses a battle. But there's a sad story that at the end of his life, he's only 32. And he reaches the end of the road. His army deserts him. He's so brave that nobody wants to follow him anymore. And actually, he's achieved everything he can already. Supposedly, he says, I have no more worlds to conquer. I guess in Leo's case, with this ascent of El Niño, that's what I'm wondering. You're just 18. You've gone out to Yosemite. You haven't even intended to do a big wall. And you've basically on-sighted El Cap. Where do you go from there? How are you ever going to top that? There's this great anecdote about Alexander, that when he comes back from a major battle, all of the great leaders around come to congratulate him, except for one. And Alexander, being a fairly gracious man, goes to find Diogenes, and he finds him lazing around in the sun, enjoying himself. And he says, "Why weren't you there, dude? Is there anything I could do for you?" And Diogenes just says, "You are blocking the sun. Could you move to your left a bit?" So I guess the question here is Leo Alexander the Great? Has he set himself up with no more worlds to conquer as this invincible hero? Or is he Diogenes? Did he manage to conquer El Cap because he was so young and naive that he just had no respect for the challenge?
Yeah, I was a really cocky little cheeky 18-year-old as well. I suppose as an 18-year-old, and I was quite a late developer, so I was still I was still a boy, really, when I was 18. You're still figuring out who you are. You're still developing all the time. We didn't actually go with the intention of climbing El Cap. Bearing in mind, in 1998, there was 2 free routes on El Cap. There was the Salathé and the Nose were really the only free routes which existed prior to that. And I remember reading about Yuji almost on sight in Salathé and being really amazed and overwhelmed by it. And we were super into sort of headpointing, like gnarly little grit-esque things on the mountain crags of Wales at the time, which is a style which has never really caught on anywhere else. That's not true. It's caught on a little bit here and there in Europe. And we sort of had the intention of doing something similar in Yosemite, because although, there's the great crags of Yosemite, the great walls, there's millions of other little buttresses. And when you put your sort of Clanberry's Pass head on, where we'd been putting all these filler little overhanging arêtes and blank walls, little pitches up to no more than 100 feet. But at the time we were super into it. And that's kind of the British way, right? We fill our crags with roots, no bolts. There's so much potential for that in Yosemite, or at least that's what I thought at the time. So we kind of went with the intention of putting up some E8s and E9s on like single pitch stuff. But then when we got there and you see El Cap in particular, it's just so ridiculously impressive. It just absolutely eclipses everything else in Yosemite, let alone, elsewhere. It's just mind-bogglingly big and clean and steep and beautiful and compelling. But it's also extremely intimidating. I mean, it only had a handful of free ascents, so it kind of free climbing El Cap wasn't even on the radar, really.
While they were in the valley, Leo and Patch met Alex and Thomas Huber. The German legends had just established the 3rd free route on El Cap, El Niño.
Oh yeah, Alex was one of the most famous climbers in the world. They just hadn't quite established themselves. We struck up a strange friendship, really, because they're so professional and so German, and Patch and I were so unprofessional and so English. And there's a really funny front cover of On the Edge, the big magazine in the UK at the time, which is a picture of me and Patch and Alex and Thomas stood in El Cap Meadow in the classic Bridwell pose, all with our shirts off. And it also just so happens that me and Patch is slightly side onto the camera and they're both front on, and it just looks ridiculous because they look literally twice the size of us. It was largely due to the Huber brothers suggesting that we should have a go, but it was also due to a kind of shift in perception that we had in the time that we were there. Not just from the Hubers, from Dean Potter, from Jose Pereira, from Conrad, from these people that we were hanging out with who climbed El Cap a lot and could see that we were really good climbers. They're like, look, you guys are good climbers. Don't worry about the scale. Don't worry about the logistics. And I'm 100% sure that the reason that it went so well is because Patch and I climbed a lot. The 2 main places where we climbed were Gogarth and the Slate Quarries and the Clanberry's Pass. But particularly Gogarth and the Slate Quarries. El Niño is very unusual El Cap route in that there's very little crack climbing. There's almost no full-on Yosemite crack climbing, exactly the opposite of the Salathé. It's face climbing, and you get these amazing slabs, incredibly beautiful El Cap granite, it's called, these beautiful technical featureless slabs, which is completely comparable to the Rainbow Slab in the Norwood Quarries where Patch and I had climbed loads. And then the rest of El Niño, it's about half and half, is diorite, which is, the Americans hate it because it's kind of a bit loose and it's a mixture of crack and face and corners, which is exactly like Gogarth style climbing. I remember clearly what happened was it was towards the end of the trip, and there's always a big storm before the end of October, and we didn't have any of the kit we needed for wall climbing. So we had this conversation, we're like, well, I'll tell you what, let's see if we can get what we need, which is essentially a portal ledge with a fly sheet, a haul bag, and some Jumars. And if we can blag that stuff off someone, we were both totally skint as well, then we'll give it a go. And 10 minutes after we had that conversation, I met Conrad Anker for the first time, and we bumped into him at the lodge, and he was like, oh, I'm going to Antarctica for 3 months tomorrow. You can borrow my portaledge and you can borrow my whole bag. Literally, in that American way, within 30 seconds of meeting him, he just handed us all the kit that we needed. And Patch and I looked at each other and we're like, well, we're on. It's weird now because I'm so used to it. You know, the guidebook description to Lord of the Flies on Dinas Cromlech, E6 6A, it's a full page long. When we did El Niño, Alex and Thomas handed us a hand-drawn topo for a 3,000 foot long 30 pitch route, which was a single piece of A4 paper with a dotted line on it. You know, I'm very used to topos now. I wasn't there. We'd never used them before. Are you kidding me? That's it. We've got to climb a 3,000 foot 30 pitch route. I mean, that would be like a book. When you stand at the bottom of El Cap and you look up, it just isn't comparable to anything that you've ever seen as a climber in the UK, or for that matter, almost anywhere else. You know, it's so big. It's the size of Scafell Pike, chopped in half from sea level, vertical wall. So the first pitch, at the time it was given 13B. I think it's been quite drastically downgraded since. I think it's maybe 12D now. But at the time, 13B, which is 8A, and it's a slab, and I'm really good at that style, and I was super fit. I flashed it to very near the top of the pitch, and then I put the quick draw on a bolt. I went up to clip it. There's a really big run out, and I went up to clip it and my foot popped, and I nearly took a monster because I had the rope in my hand and it was really run out anyway. And I held it, and then I dropped the rope, and I had that kind of panic where I was like, should I try and clip it? Should I try and keep going? I'm going to take this is like an ankle breaking fall. And then I thought, screw it. There's another 29 pitches, and this isn't even one of the hardest ones. So I grabbed the quick draw, clipped the rope in, lowered down, pulled the rope, and then did it second go. And then I fucking onsighted every other pitch. It was heavily chalked, and that was the reason that I onsighted it, is because the Hubers, they kind of introduced the full-on red pointing of El Cap, where you top down, you know, you drop 3,000 foot of rope down the crag, and you red point in the way that we do on hard routes in the UK, and the way that you do on sport climbs. And they prepped it more than I had ever seen a route prepped, you know, like super ticked up, every foothold, lots of heavy tick marking, which actually makes an enormous difference on that style of granite slab climbing. There's no way anyone in the world would stand a chance of onsighting anything hard on Yosemite slabs unless they're ticked, because you just can't see anything. And then you see a tick mark like way over there and you think, well, there must be something there. So yeah, that was a massive advantage, basically, that they'd literally just done it a week earlier, 2 weeks earlier. However, we also learned the hard way that double rope technique is not good if you Jumar in, because you Jumar in on 8mm ropes. And I remember halfway up the wall, we struggled with the logistics, like hauling and setting up the portaledge. It took us about 3 hours to set up the portaledge the first time, because it's not quite as, actually it is logical, it just wasn't. It was an old ledge and it needed a bit of bashing around, and we thought we were doing something wrong, whereas we just weren't trying hard enough, you know what I mean? And hauling the bags, we passed a knot. We did a big haul, so passing a knot was, and now I can do it in 3 minutes. But without the experience, it's like, how the hell are we going to do this then? Didn't even have ground school with anyone. And Jumaring too. We didn't even know how to Jumar properly. That compared to the technique I use now, it was really rubbish. There's a big ledge called the Big Sur, approximately halfway up the wall, and it's a sweet ledge. It's a dead flat, not huge, but spacious ledge. It's probably 5 meters wide, 1 meter deep, but dead flat. And it's a wonderful place. We spent a couple of nights there. There's a load of hard climbing right off that, another 2 hard slab pitches. And then about 4 easier still hard pitches that lead up to this giant roof called the Black Cave. And we did that in a day, and then we fixed down to the ledge because they're in a perfect straight line, but we tied 2 60-meter 8mm ropes together and wrapped down, and it was super spacey. You've got to pass the knot, obviously, and it worked. And that's right. I went down first, and we had to balance. It's overhanging, but then it's slabby underneath. So you're in space the whole time going, shit, I hope this works. 2,000 foot up the wall, dangling on an 8mm bouncy rope. And it did. It landed us straight back onto the ledge. And then the next day, we had to Jumar back up. Then there was a storm the next day. So we got stormed on, which was just incredible, being in this big storm on the wall, engulfed in cloud, and the whole experience was completely magical. And then the storm cleared, and then we had to Jumar up to the high point. And that's right. I went up first, then Patch came up, and then we got there, and I'd already dropped one of the chalk bags, and then Patch dropped the other on the way up, so we didn't have a chalk bag, which is a big deal when you're climbing in the California sunshine on greasy granite. You need chalk. So I had to wrap back down 300 feet more, like nearly 400 foot. And back then, I used to find Jumar a bitch, and it is a bitch, Jumar up such a thin dynamic rope tied together. You know, there's 20-foot stretch when you start going. Yeah. So I had to go back down, and then we made a chalk bag out of a little stuff sack and a couple of wires. We put 2 wires around the mouth to hold it open. And then I Jumared all the way back up. We ditched all the stuff. We left everything on the big Sur halfway up the wall. And then we climbed to the top of the wall without hauling the stuff because we were using more energy hauling than we were climbing. So we had a massive day where we did 1,200 feet of climbing, starting off with an 8A roof pitch and finished in the dark. And then we went back later to get the stuff. I think what we said is if the Great Roof goes well, we'll keep going. Because if it doesn't, that could take a whole day just to redpoint that pitch. And I on-sighted it. And I got to the belay and I was like, Patch, because if he'd wanted to lead that pitch as well, that would have really messed our logistics up. But he already hadn't done 2 of the pitches. He was like, screw it, I'll just second. So we're like, right, let's go. And it was the most amazing day. I remember clearly you belay on a tree, the last pitch, which is right on the edge of the wall. And it was dark. And I remember thinking, holy shit, I unsighted it. You know, I did it first go. I didn't in my wildest dreams think that I was going to unsight it. I remember clearly a month earlier seeing El Cap for the first time and thinking, oh my God, Yuji Hirayama nearly unsighted the Salathé last year. And that was just overwhelming. It just seemed so many leagues above my competency. Tied to that tree at the top, being patched, I thought, wow, this is a life changer. I think a great deal of it was youthful bravado and confidence, and we totally went for it, and we went all in, and it went incredibly well. You know, it couldn't have gone any better really, apart from that bloody quick draw on the first pitch. It was a completely life-changing experience for me in multiple ways. The evolution of perception to think, wow, I thought that was impossible a week ago. And not only was it not impossible, it wasn't even that hard. Imagine what might be possible. So it was a complete revelation. And then the following season, I went back a year later with exactly the opposite mindset, where I was like, right, you know, there's big sections of El Niño. There's like scrambling in the middle of the wall. There's a whole pitch of like 4th class in the middle, and you can't even see those features from the ground. There's massive ledge systems that are completely invisible from the meadow, partly because they're so far away and partly because of the aspect. And you only need a few matchsticks in the right places to be able to free climb something. So in 1999, I went back and I thought, right, anything's possible. You just have to find the Braille Trail. You just have to find that line of matchsticks. And I spent 2 entire seasons trying to free climb the Dorm Wall, and didn't find the way. Got shut down. But it was a huge revelation. And I remember thinking in the meadow the next day after we got down from El Niño, looking up thinking, wow, there's an entire pitch of scrambling and you can't even see it. It looks impossible. It looks like completely blank bolt ladder terrain, and actually it's scrambling. Wow. You know, it was completely like having a different pair of eyes.
Leo had made headlines in the climbing press before. You might remember from the first episode of Factor 2 that he on-sighted Master's Wall in a pair of shoes that were too big for him when he was just 17. He'd also climbed Lord of the Flies by head torch. This was a game changer because it had global significance. Luckily for Leo, Ian Parnell was on a neighbouring route and took some photographs of him and Patch while they were climbing. Patch and Leo were away travelling and climbing and not necessarily aware of what was being reported about them at the time.
The media thing kind of came off the back of that, really, which was extremely fortunate because if there'd been no photos, there wouldn't have been a story. And also, everything was a lot slower then. This was in the days before everything was videoed. There wasn't even any phone signal in Yosemite until about 2002, let alone 4G, and, you know, Facebook didn't exist. You know, El Cap free climbing, it's the best crag in the world. And then for a solid 10 years, it didn't catch on. I couldn't believe it. Alex, the Huber brothers and Tommy Caldwell, and to a lesser extent myself, and then a couple of other people, just had a field day for more than a decade where no one else was free climbing on El Cap. And then it caught on about 10 years ago, you know, the sort of 2010-ish, this decade. Finally, everyone was like, hang on a minute, this is the best crag in the world. And now it's popular, and I'm glad that we had that time, because unless you're like really good at that style of climbing, you can do it fast. Redpointing on a wall is not a simple process, and so things get popular. And if there's other people trying to free climb the same route at the same time, that can be a bit of a mess, basically, because there's ropes everywhere and aid climbers coming through, and it can get a bit ugly. That El Niño experience was just so perfect. I've almost been looking for that again, because it was, not only did the climb go extremely well, the sort of psychological journey of first big wall, being caught in a storm up there, all these new experiences which are extremely adventurous, aside from the sort of technical perspective, the performance element of the climb. It's such a big adventure climbing a giant cliff. It's proper swashbuckling old school adventure. Although I have had some other amazing days in Yosemite on El Cap, none of them have been the same as that 5 days, because they were no longer fresh. It was no longer unknown. Yeah, I didn't know that route. Yeah, I didn't know if we could link both those walls, but it's a different order of magnitude to that completely blind experience where you have no idea what's going to happen or what's coming up. It's difficult to remember how you used to see things, because your perspective evolves. It's like watching a child grow up. It's so slow that you don't notice the changes. But then when you look back over periods of time, it's almost impossible to remember. You know, you think, oh, you know, as you were saying, I used to think that was the living end, and now.
So I think my hypothesis about Leo wasn't really correct at the start. El Niño opened his eyes up to what was possible, and there were more worlds to be conquered after all. El Niño gave him the confidence to be a part of the Stone Monkeys. It demonstrated his ability to pull a performance out of the bag. But it is bittersweet, and we'll all have done this. While he's got other adventures to have, he can never repeat that first naive roll of the dice. That sense you get when you're coming of age and you plant the first real seeds of the direction your adult life will take. I'd not really thought about it in this way, that you just can't replicate that feeling. You just have to revel in the memory. You'll have more great adventures in the future, but nothing's quite as sweet as the first. You've been listening to Factor 2 from UK Climbing. I'm Will Treasure. Thanks for listening.